Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another round of Haynsworth, Sinkler, Boyd's employment law webinar series. Happy to be back after a couple of sessions being off. I am joined here with my colleague, Chris Gant Sorensen. And we are back today talking a little bit more about COVID. Hopefully we'll be getting to a point this summer, hopefully, where maybe we won't have to talk about COVID as much, but there's still a lot going on currently, particularly with respect to vaccines. So that's what we're going to talk about today. A couple of reminders before we get started. Subscribe to our blog if you're not already. We are trying to provide as much relevant content to you through our blog in between the webinars. The webinars are good to provide sort of in-depth conversations, but the blog is really good to put you on notice of new things that come out in between our webinars. And we've still got our COVID resources page up on our website as well that has additional information even beyond employment law related stuff. With any legal issue related to COVID. As always, most of you have attended one of these before, but we will provide the presentation slides, so don't worry about copying down the material on the actual slides. And we have the Q&A chat feature, and feel free to submit questions in the chat as we go along. While I'm presenting, Chris can answer and vice versa. And if there's anything particularly that we feel like we need to expand on or you want answered so that everybody else can hear it, we can also do that as well. So with that being said, we will go ahead and jump into it. Just a brief update on COVID. I read this morning something interesting, and it was all over the news this morning. Some of you probably saw it, that we are reaching the point with the vaccine that, you know, we're a couple of weeks away from every person who's willing to take the vaccine will have taken it. And that means there's going to be a surplus, and the people who, in a few weeks time, the people who have not taken the vaccine have not taken it because they're not going to get the vaccine, whether that's political beliefs or medical issues or religion or whatever, they've got an opposition to the vaccine. And so experts are kind of a little bit down on the idea that we're going to have potentially herd immunity against COVID-19. They're estimating that maybe once it's all said and done, maybe less than half Americans will be vaccinated, which is a little bit scary. And so we don't know how it's going to mutate and all that. And I say that for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think that it is going to be here to stay a little bit throughout the summer and the fall. It's going to continue to be something that we deal with. And then just as far as your own workforce, you know, if less than half of Americans are going to be vaccinated, that means that, you know, chances are you're going to have a fair number of people in your workforce that are not vaccinated. And that certainly creates some issues moving forward. The good news, of course, is that a lot of people are vaccinated. And so I think there is going to be less safety issues in the workplace, less transmission, less people asking for time off of work because of health issues related to COVID, et cetera. Work and travel is starting to look like normal again. A lot of businesses are calling employees back to the offices, doing away in certain circumstances with quarantines after travel, and those types of things. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about some pending legislation in South Carolina specifically. The General Assembly has been active, at least in introducing and debating some legislation in relation to COVID that I think is going to be interesting to follow and see. So a couple of lingering questions, and if you have others, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll try to answer as many of them as we can. These are just some examples of calls that I've gotten from clients on how to handle things. And I've gotten a lot of calls from clients about, okay, is it time to tell people to take off masks in the office? Should we ask workers if they got the vaccine? What about when we hire new employees? Can we ask that in the interview process? Do we have any obligation at this point in time to continue to grant work from home requests? Do we need a new COVID safety policy now that, a lot of people are vaccinated? Do we need one policy for vaccinated workers, one policy for unvaccinated workers? And so those are just some of the types of questions that if you have not thought through, is just to sort of get everybody thinking today while we're all talking about this, and should help us frame the issue a little bit. So one quick update. We're not going to delve too deeply into these issues, and then we'll turn it over to Chris. We've talked a lot about the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. I think that most of you are familiar with that. That's the paid sick leave law that was part of the original stimulus bill way back when. President Biden's latest stimulus extended the applicability of the FFCRA through September 30th. As a reminder, that is voluntary at this point in time. Employers are not required to comply. However, if you do choose to continue participation in the program, you can receive reimbursement through payroll tax credits if you do. That is not intended to be a business expense. The federal government is picking up the tab for that one, so make sure you avail yourself of that if you are doing that. It wasn't just an extension. That they did add some new provisions, which we're happy to answer questions about, but they added a couple of additional eligibility reasons for leave, particularly such as getting the COVID vaccine or recovering from COVID side effects. And I think I've gotten a couple calls from clients about potential abuse related to people going out and getting a shot and claiming they're sick for 5 days after. I have not heard of any of people being that sick from the shot, but I have heard of people being, sick for a day or two, maybe from getting the shot. I was also seeking or waiting for a diagnosis. For the emergency family medical leave portion of it, increased that from 10 to 12 weeks, and it reset sick leave rights to zero as of April 1st. In other words, if you had already taken your hours, that those were reset, potentially could get more as of April 1st. So that's the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. There was also a new federal subsidy for COBRA premiums for workers who lost employment due to a qualifying reason, were not discharged for gross misconduct or something like that. And the federal government is 100% subsidizing the employees' COBRA premiums if they're eligible during the time period April 1st through September 30th. That could include those covered under COBRA who lost coverage earlier but fall within that time range as well. And the employer is eligible for tax credits for this. And again, it's not meant to be a business expense. The Department of Labor has issued updated guidance, I think, which is pretty helpful, and some FAQs related to this. And they've also provided model notices as well. And you can find those on the Department of Labor website. The easiest thing to do for that, if you want to look at them, is just Google DOL COBRA, new COBRA, something like that, and it'll be one of the first two things that popped up. I did that this morning. So go check that out, and also happy to answer questions on that. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Chris to talk a little bit more about some vaccine issues.
Thanks, Perry. All right, so the reason we're talking a little in depth about vaccines is both of us are beginning to get questions about mandatory vaccines and what should employers do if their employees are not availing themselves of vaccines. In fact, there's a question in the box today about that. And Perry, I'd love to have you answer that in addition to me answering it for the attendee. But so I think that's an evolving issue, and I think it's one that we need to consider to revisit or revisit as time goes on. But today we'll give you our best advice today. So most companies have not chosen to mandate. And as vaccines become more and more available, you can see where certain employers might change their mind on that. Certainly healthcare workers or anybody who has a vulnerable population would be justified in mandating a vaccine for COVID, just like you do for the flu. That's pretty common. So if you find yourself thinking about, okay, I think we want to mandate, I want to make sure, Perry and I want to make sure that you have the considerations that you need before you do that. And the reason I say that it's a little bit more complicated is you absolutely legally can do it. And I, in fact, had a client call me and say, can we do it? Should we do it? And we had, a few conversations about it. And initially I was like, yes, you should do it. You can do it. There's issues with it, but it's manageable. But the more we explored it, I started thinking maybe the issues outweigh the desire to do it right now or the reason to do it right now. So it's all a balancing of the risk and the benefits and the cost, and really practical cost, I think, really weighed in on that. So the other thing is the last point, what are you going to do if you have this policy? Are you going to fire workers if they refuse to take it? And what if they're workers who can't perform their work remotely, even if they would have a qualifying excuse, and you don't have anything for them to do? And this is what happens when the practical issues start getting in the way of what the law will otherwise allow you to do. All right, next slide. So EEOC has been clear that you can mandate the vaccine. And specifically, they said that an employer who's thinking about mandating the vaccine should apply the ADA direct threat test. And everybody remembers there's two tests with the ADA. If an employee comes and asks for an accommodation, there's the accommodation, process, which is different than direct threat. Direct threat is analyzing whether or not the other employees or the employee themselves or your client population is at risk of serious harm, and therefore you have the direct threat. And there are about four prongs that you would look at to analyze this, and we're glad to provide those. We're not going into that this in depth this time. It's a very thorough inquiry that must be made anytime direct threat under an ADA standard is analyzed. And you can see where direct threat would be met with healthcare workers, hospitals, or retirement facilities, other vulnerable populations, children's home, anything you can think about that. And so from there, after you've made a determination, all right, I think it would pose a direct threat to any of those groups of folks, employees, what have you. I mean, a manufacturing facility could even be direct threat because you're all working right beside each other and maybe you can't have the distance. Doesn't mean you should do it though, right? So if you decide that you want to mandate because you believe there's necessary reasons justifying it, then you next have to look at, all right, who gets the exceptions and how are we going to, process this? So the two exceptions legally are disability. I cannot comply with the mandatory vaccination policy because I have a doctor's note that indicates that I've had trouble with the flu shot and my doctor is advising me not to get the COVID vaccine at this time. And you can see where providers might do that with someone who has severe allergy reactions to things. The provider might say, let's wait a little bit and see how things are going to see before you do it. So it wouldn't be that would have credibility. I could see where that would be. And then some folks also have religious beliefs. And that's the thing that we're seeing actually a lot, that it's against their religious beliefs to have a vaccine. And we'll talk a little bit about that, what you're permitted to inquire further on about that. And then there are a lot of folks who are having political or freedom issues with any sort of mandatory anything. And this really shouldn't come as a surprise to any of us in this day and age. And that is not a legally recognized exception. So that's an important thing to remember. All right, next slide. So a couple things to think about. We're still in the legal bucket. Perry and I've talked about this. We just did a podcast on it. And I think the practical bucket is the thornier bucket. But so let's say we're dealing with a mandatory vaccination policy and you're going to implement it. Some of the things you've got to figure out is who's actually going to give the vaccines. If you don't have a third party come in and do it, a third party provider, if you don't have an on-site clinic that might be on-site, but it's third party, it's provided, and you have a very clear medical wall of information between what they know and what you know. As an employer, you shouldn't know that stuff. So that's the first first level of analysis. Who's going to give the shot, right? And if it's a third party that's just coming in and giving the shot and leaving, and they're keeping all the medical information, and you're not getting any of the medical information, you're not involved, you or your employees at all, in the pre-screening or anything like that, that to me is the best case scenario. That is what I would recommend. And I would want to make sure that you looked at your agreements with that entity to make sure that they very clearly defined, we don't want to see anything medical. It's completely separate. It's your responsibility to keep it separate and not show it to us, and take it with you. Some employers want to have their own staff administer the vaccines. If you do that, think in terms of if you're self-insured and the level of HIPAA training that you have to process claims. And it's going to be that same level of training for anyone who's going to be administering the vaccinations. That's at the outset. That's got to be the case. And so you can see already, if you're not already set up for that, that could be a problem. And usually the folks that are HIPAA trained to manage claims are your HR folks, not necessarily your nurse or healthcare folks. I don't know about y'all. HR folks are awesome, but I imagine a lot of them don't want to be giving people shots and maybe shouldn't be giving people shots. So who's going to do it if it's not them? The other thing is, how are the pre-screening examinations going to go? I mean, for those of you who've had your vaccination, you know what you're supposed to ask before you have the COVID-19 vaccination. And there are a number of inquiries on that pre-screening form that are medical inquiries. So the EOC specifically says it's not a medical inquiry to ask someone if they've had a vaccine. It is legal for an employer to require a vaccine, but employers cannot ask about any medical conditions while they're asking employees to have the vaccination done. So I don't know how you do that unless you're not complying with the proper screening technique for a COVID-19 vaccine. By necessity, this form is going to require you to ask those questions, look at them, digest them, and decide whether or not this person gets to go forward with the vaccine. So I can't see how that would be plausible for an employer to do with their own staff. So that is a very long-winded but detailed on-purpose way to explain why, if you're going to do it, you need to have somebody on site that's a third party to do it. All right, so aside from that, if you're going to mandate it, and you're not going to have any sort of on-site mandating, but instead you're going to require them to go off-site and come back with their card, then you need to pay them for any cost associated with it, which I don't think there's going to be any cost with getting the vaccine, but you're going to need to pay them for their time to go get the vaccine, have the vaccination, come back. If they have complications of a mandatory vaccination policy, that's going to then be covered by workers' comp. And this one I threw in there. I think this is such a long shot. But, as we were pulling this together, the Johnson & Johnson vaccination was pulled off the market for a while because of the blood clots. And so I could conceive of an argument that a plaintiff's counsel would make that a claim that an employee makes for any complications that they develop as a result of being required to comply with a vaccine might fall outside of the protection of the Workers' Compensation Exclusivity Act, and which would permit the employee an opportunity to sue the employer in tort. Now, it is a far stretch that this would ever happen, and it would have to be that the employer was requiring the employee to take a vaccination that has been pulled off the market and is not being recommended. And right now, that's not the scenario. But I just mention it because it requires employers to keep up with how these vaccines are impacting folks. If you're going to mandate it, that's going to be something you have to think about. Next slide. All right. So what sort of accommodations do we have to consider? Disability and religious, and we talked about that. So remember, it's always on a case-by-case basis. So if you have a group of folks that you know their essential job functions are going to require them to serve vulnerable populations, any sort of analysis that's going to be done with any accommodation request can't be by the whole group. So if you have a huge number of the group coming and saying to you, religious reasons, it's against my religion, you can't just summarily deny them all. You're actually going to have to go through it case by case with each one of them. And of course, disability is the same. And obviously, disability exemptions lead themselves to more of a case by case analysis, because anybody who is not able to take the vaccination has different medical reasons associated with that. As with any accommodation request on the basis of a medical inquiry or a medical issue, you're always allowed to verify that the disability precludes them from complying with the policy in the first place. In regards to a religious exemption request, you're permitted to, by the EEOC's own guidance, ask them, please indicate how your sincerely held religious belief or a practice in that belief is violated by having the vaccination. So just saying I have a religious objection to it, you can choose to accept that, but an employer is allowed to ask, how does your sincerely held belief or any sort of tenet of that belief, how is it violated by being required to take the vaccination? The literature out there indicates that a lot of folks, a lot of employees who are asserting it just for the sake of asserting it will usually stand down and go and proceed to have the vaccination. They'll decide it's not worth it. So it's worth requiring them to answer that question, and you're allowed to ask that question. If you do it, you need to do it with everyone. You need to do it with every single person who makes the religious exemption request. But after that, if they're able to answer it, you don't get to weigh in on whether or not it seems valid to you. As long as it's sincerely held religious belief, you need to grant it. So then what do you do? And that's where it gets really dicey, depending on what their job is. So both standards permit you to deny any accommodation request on the basis of undue hardship. And with any undue hardship analysis, you always need to document that very well. You need to document your interactive process with the employee where you're discussing back and forth, tell me what it is, document all of that, all the discussions that you have. And then you also need to document if you decide it's undue hardship, why. One of the things that we need to always think about too is just because you can't have the vaccination doesn't mean you can't avail yourself of the other protections we've been using for the last year that are sufficient. So we'll cover that more later, because I think as a practical matter, that starts to create problems for any mandatory vaccination policy. Next slide. So the documentation from the provider. When you send that, though, don't forget that it's almost like the vaccination is a red herring. So absolutely, you've decided you're going to have a mandatory vaccination policy, but just because someone doesn't want to have the vaccination for whatever reason or truly needs an accommodation for a medical reason, doesn't mean that if you need to grant an accommodation that's been established under the law, you can't still require them to show up and wear PPE and come to work. I think a lot of folks are thinking that this will permit them to continue their remote work, and it may well, if that was a reasonable accommodation to begin with, but it does not automatically mean that you can't comply with a return to work policy just because you can't get vaccinated, even if it is a mandatory vaccination policy. And so I would say don't get bogged down with that. And then make sure that whatever documentation you're getting from the provider is clarifying we have a mandatory vaccination policy. This employee has indicated that a medical condition prohibits them from having the vaccination. Will this also preclude them from wearing PPE? So I dropped in the undue hardship factors here. for the accommodation. Those are the things that you need to consider and be able to document the reasons, specific reasons. Don't just write undue hardship as to why you would need to deny an ADA accommodation. That is a higher standard to meet. And you need to be able to explain very thoroughly why it's an issue. All right, next slide. Religious accommodation, the undue hardship standard is much less. It's the de minimis or trivial cost to the employer. So it doesn't take much to meet it. I mean, just that you had a vulnerable population would in any other situation probably meet the religious exemption request. So additional cost, having to hire other folks, those sorts of things, those are going to meet de minimis. Next slide. Alternative accommodations. So this is where it starts to slide into the practical issue. An employer who is considering whether or not to grant an exemption to their mandatory vaccination policy for someone who has a disability would be hard pressed to contend that they're not able to do so and that the employee has to be excluded from the workplace when we've just spent our whole last year, if this is a workplace that required somebody to be on site, using PPE and social distancing. And that still is something that is considered to be protective in the workplace by the CDC as well as OSHA. So how can we fairly contend that what was good enough for this last year is no longer good enough? And I would indicate that that to me has been the biggest hurdle to jump over any mandatory vaccination policy at this time. So unlike the flu, COVID-19 is dealing with CDC is dealing with the COVID-19 safe practices differently. And if you notice, because it's an EUA status, some of our largest healthcare providers aren't requiring the COVID-19 vaccination mandatorily when they would otherwise require flu vaccines mandatorily. So I would say the best advice I could give is when something's an EUA status, and with all of these other practical issues, it might be best to follow the lead of those larger healthcare entities. There's a reason that they're not doing it. It makes sense. Don't choose to be the first one out on the chopping block unless you want to. Next slide. The religious exemption. So there are two cases that are recent where courts upheld. Well, one of them, the court upheld an employer's termination of an employee who refused to have the flu shot. This was a hospital, and the employee just refused to have the flu shot on the basis of religious exemption. And the court indicated that when the employer terminated the employee for doing that, that it was not wrongful termination and they were permitted to do so. It wasn't a Title VII violation on the basis of their religion because there's a vulnerable population and it was necessary for all of the healthcare providers who were treating the folks in the hospital to have the flu shot. It was reasonable. And so they held that the court met the de minimis standard and it was okay to require this, and it's okay to deny the exemption and fire someone who refuses to have it. In a North Carolina case, and this is a Fourth Circuit opinion, so it is an opinion that would help inform any sort of adjudication on a lawsuit in our state. The court in dicta, which means this wasn't part of the holding, but the court did come right out and say an employer faced with a religious exemption request in a hospital environment does meet the de minimis cost of granting the exception and therefore can deny it. When you have a vulnerable population, you're going to have to hire more folks and therefore it will cause more cost or create more cost for the hospital. You can deny the request then. So you have to conclude that if you're a healthcare provider or an entity that serves vulnerable populations in our jurisdiction, we would be able to rely on this case, EEOC versus Mission Hospital, to conclude that you would be upheld. The problem is we have not had this adjudicated in the COVID-19 world. And so in our conservative advice, the thinking is let's give this vaccine a little bit more time to take hold before we make it mandatory. And before Perry and I feel comfortable enough saying we can rely on these cases to justify any termination of a direct care worker who does not take the COVID-19 vaccination on the basis of a religious exemption. So Perry, I'd ask you to weigh in if you have anything to add on that here particularly.
No, I don't really have anything to add on that. I do think this whole discussion around accommodations that Chris just outlined is really good information in general about how you go through the accommodations process. I mean, I think that applies out, obviously we got the flu examples here. But that's also going to apply with some variation to, other disability and religious accommodation requests that you get. Obviously the facts will be a little bit different. But yeah, I think that's all really good information. I don't really have anything else to add there.
Okay, great. All right, thank you. Next slide. All right, so this is Perry. Before we slide off though, I did want to mention specifically that the EEOC, even though they said you can have this vaccination, you can mandate it. And with disability accommodations, they say, and Title VII religious accommodations or denial of them, that you exclude the employee from the workplace, you don't fire them. And so that's another practical issue, because if you can't fire them, but you're going to exclude them from the workplace, then what do? Do you let them use their paid leave? If you don't let them use the paid leave, it's the same as an adverse employment action. Does this mean they can go file an unemployment claim? If they can file an unemployment claim, are you a reimbursable employer and we have to pay it back dollar for dollar? Even if you're not a reimbursable employer, isn't it going to increase your experience rating? And how long are you going to let them sit out there languishing excluded from the workplace? So these are more practical issues, I would think, that you just vet and think through before you press on, because I'd hate for the bottom dollar to not be helped at all and the safety not to be helped that much, because if you're following CDC guidelines, everybody's still wearing their mask, to put yourself through all this anguish and trouble. So thanks. Back to you, Perry.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I did think of one other thing. I mean, I guess the only other thing I would add is that for some companies, I do think it is helpful to ask your employees whether they've been vaccinated. I think it's a good idea to kind of get a census on that. You got to be a little bit careful how you do it. Obviously, you're not, if they say they haven't been vaccinated, you're not saying, well, why not? And all this kind of stuff. And well, not telling them to go get it and that type of thing. But, I think that may impact some of the decisions you make about mandating and or some of these policy decisions I'm about to talk about. I mean, if you have 20 employees and 19 got vaccinated and you've got one holdout, are you really going to make it mandatory, create this mandatory policy when you've got this one person? So, from a practical standpoint, I do think that that's a good idea, to know that. The only other, I guess, issue with knowing is it potentially creates a problem, I guess, if down the road you fire somebody and they claim, I got fired because I wouldn't take the vaccine. You can't then claim, well, I didn't know whether they had the vaccine or not, because once you ask and once you know, you know. So you have to be careful with what you do with that information, and obviously the confidentiality aspect of it as well. I'm obviously not sharing that information and keeping it on a need to know basis. But yeah, that's the only other thing I think about. I mean, I think that could impact your decision on mandating and these policies also. Anything on that, Chris, about asking them if they've gotten vaccinated?
No, that's absolutely right. I'm glad you reminded us that. Yeah, EOC has said you can do that. Perry's right about that. And the only thing is you would deal with that with all the other medical information the same way that you do. So, not sharing it with the decision makers, keeping it under lock and key like you would any other medical information. But that's a good thing to know, actually. I like Perry's very practical point of, look, if most of them are already vaccinated, let's just not go through the trouble of it. And another thing that we talked about on the podcast about this, which is the Survive HR podcast, it'll be posted soon, and we'll drop it in here because four of us talk about it, is that it might be compelling to post the percentage of your employees that are vaccinated. You can do that. You can't speak about who is, but post the percentage, and that might encourage the other folks when they see that, especially if it's a majority of them, oh, well, I'll just go ahead and get it, and, for whatever reason. Maybe that pushes them over the edge. It can't hurt.
Yeah, we had a lengthy discussion about whether incentivizing employees would do anything or not. I mean, if you offer an additional paid day off to go get it, or you give them a Starbucks gift card if they go get it, is that going to move the needle? I don't know. I mean, I think there's a group of people that are morally or medically opposed to it, who are not going to get it regardless of what you try to incentivize or encourage. But there could be employees here or there who are sort of indifferent about it, and maybe that encouragement or incentivizing could work. So with that, I'll move on to talking a little bit about what to do with your policies now, because I think that's where I'm getting most of my questions at this point. What do we do with these policies that we enacted last year? Some of them seem outdated, some of them we're not really enforcing, that kind of thing. I think my second bullet point here I'll mention first, which is that I do think it makes sense to dust those off and review them pretty continuously on whether or not they make sense given the current situation. Travel quarantine is one example. Are you going to still require somebody who, traveled maybe to North Carolina, if you're in South Carolina, and you're going to really make them stay home for 2 weeks now? Those types of things might need to be looked at. So, take a look at your policies and see if they need to be revised, because, policies are no good if you don't follow them. But I think the primary point to keep in mind and to keep coming back to is that, I think for business liability purposes, you've still got to follow the CDC and DHEC guidance as closely as possible to fight off claims of negligence or reports from employees to OSHA or DHEC or things like that. And this can be a little bit frustrating, because I think the CDC and DHEC are going to be naturally cautious, which is understandable, and they are probably months behind where a lot of businesses want to be. In other words, most private businesses, particularly smaller ones that maybe aren't having any issues, really wish they would relax some of their requirements. And that's just going to kind of be the way it is for a little while. I mean, you're probably just going to be a little bit frustrated that they're not relaxing requirements more quickly. I've had this conversation with a number of clients. Nothing is to necessarily say that, in some instances you can't relax yours a little bit more than in situations where they're unclear. But I mean, there is legal risk there in doing that, I think. So just keep that in mind. And if you're thinking about doing something that doesn't, hew closely to those guidelines, reach out to us to talk about it, see whether it makes sense. One confusing thing that I've encountered is that, the CDC has relaxed their guidelines a bit for vaccinated persons. They say we can now, gather in small groups of other vaccinated persons indoors. So that's good news for some of our summer plans. But that often is not really going to apply to the workplace. I mean, if you have 100 employees and 70 are vaccinated and 30 are not vaccinated, and you're all interacting together in the workplace, you're back to work, or you're on a rotating schedule or whatever. Those CDC guidelines aren't doing those vaccinated workers too much good there. And so generally speaking, I think as a starting point, your policies regarding masks in the workplace, your policies regarding social distance requirements, I think the vast majority of those probably need to stay in place at this point in time, at least until we get a little further along, get a little bit more information. Again, there are situations here and there, like, do you have a conference room of 5 employees and all of them are vaccinated? Can they take their masks off in there? Yes, that's probably okay. So there are situations, but I think, I don't think it would be wise to just say, hey, no more masks in the office. We're pushing all the, desks and chairs back, together again, all of that type of stuff. So keep that in mind. Next slide, please. All right. So another sticky issue that's come up is, can we treat vaccinated workers different from unvaccinated workers? Can we relax our mask requirement for those vaccinated and those that are not vaccinated? I think from a very general standpoint, we'll start from the position that theoretically you could. I mean, as long as you're within CDC guidelines. If CDC comes out tomorrow and says, we no longer recommend masks for any vaccinated person in public, no matter where you are. Theoretically, if they said that and you're in compliance with CDC guidance, you could create two different sets of rules for vaccinated and unvaccinated workers. There's no law right now saying you can't do that. What you do have to be careful of when you create and I think there's circumstances you could, I think we have to be careful of is potential discrimination claims. If you're creating those two classes, is that discriminating either intentionally or unintentionally against those who are not vaccinated because they've got medical issues? And I think this really could come up in, I don't think the mask thing is that big of a deal, but I mean, let's say that you're providing work opportunities and you're trying to decide which employee to send to a conference in New York, and you have one employee that's vaccinated, one who's not. You say, well, we're going to send the vaccinated employee, and the unvaccinated employee can't get it because of, on medical advice from their doctor. Is that denying work opportunity to somebody based on their disability? Those are the types of things you got to think through and be careful with, and obviously don't relax your work, your safety rules too quickly because of OSHA. President Biden has been adamant that he's increasing the number of enforcement officers with OSHA, and so I think that's a real concern moving forward. And information there, I saw, I didn't see the full question. I saw something pop up in the chat about who in the organization should know or can know about which employees are vaccinated or not. I think the best thing I can tell you there is only those with a need to know, and that's kind of vague, but I think if you don't have an HR manager or something like that, you've got to designate somebody that specially serves that role for this purpose, whether it's if you don't have HR, somebody at your organization does those functions, I would presume, whether it's the CFO or something like that. Chris, what do you think? You're on mute.
I was trying to say I wouldn't hear the typing. I actually just answered that. So if you're still following CDC guidelines, and everybody, and when they're in common area, are required to wear their mask, common area, and they have to stay social distance and they wear a mask, then I can't imagine a situation where there'd be any manager who has a need to know. So then it'd be fine to only have it as the HR standpoint. But to Perry's good point, the CDC is already saying that it's okay for folks to meet indoors without masks as long as they're distanced, if they've been vaccinated. And so it's absolutely true. Perry's right. You can start to envision a space where CDC's guidance would permit vaccinated versus unvaccinated people to be treated differently. And in that scenario, you would have to decide as a company what your policy was going to be. And if you steered clear of, or if you decided to follow CDC and let those who are vaccinated, let the restrictions loosen a little bit for those, then I think at that point, if you know that some folks will not be able to remain social distance, besides putting the onus on those that are unvaccinated to continue to wear the mask and protect themselves, I think you might have to speak to a manager and say, hey, FYI, they're not vaccinated. But I think it's very important, if we find ourselves in that position, to caution the manager that there can't be any discussions about the why. And it's such, again, a political issue that it's just one that a manager needs to stay away from, because it can step in other issues pretty quickly. What do you think, Perry?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. All right, next slide. Okay. I'm going to talk about, and again, happy to answer questions on all that. I'm going to shift a little bit talking about a couple of pieces of pending legislation at the South Carolina State House. Actually, a lot going on. COVID has become such a workplace issue that I think we've got more employment related legislation than we normally do. And Jason had asked a question in the chat or the Q&A about business liability. I think the big ticket item at the State House right now is the South Carolina COVID-19 Liability Immunity Act. That's Senate 147. And this is the one that provides immunity from lawsuits for businesses that follow public health guidance. Essentially says somebody tries to sue you saying they got COVID-19 because of something your business did wrong. As long as you're following public health guidance, you're immune from lawsuit. And so it's pretty helpful legislation. South Carolina, well, let's talk about what the legislation does. I've copied in there. This is directly out of the bill. This is the main portion of it, notwithstanding other provision of law, covered entity that reasonably adheres to public health guidance at the time of the conduct giving rise to a claim shall be entitled to immunity. It has exceptions for gross negligence, reckless, willful, or intentional misconduct. But again, that's going to be tough to prove. And again, the idea is as long as we've got businesses in South Carolina that are trying to do the right thing and be reasonable about health and safety of their employees, we don't want a bunch of lawsuits against businesses because of COVID. It's something that you can't help. Back to Jason's point. So, and this is most claims by employees are going to be covered under workers' comp. So if you have an employee that claims they got COVID at work, their exclusive remedy for that is to file a workers' comp claim. And that's interesting, of course, because what's the workers' comp carrier going to do with that? How do you prove that it's at work? I'd be interested for people to put in the chat or the Q&A any experiences they've had with workers' comp on this. But a lot of decisions I've seen that clients have shared with me from workers' comp carriers have denied the claims because they can't prove that it happened at work. That's fairly common. I was talking to the PD Sherm group on Tuesday, and they have had some comp claims covered. So I think it's a little bit all over the board there, but would be interested to hear anybody's thoughts on that. But this specific bill makes clear that workers' comp is an exclusive remedy for employees. So this would really protect customers, members of the public, relatives of employees, all those types of contractors and vendors, all those types of claims that might be out there against your business. All right, next slide. So South Carolina is the only state in the Southeast not to have passed similar legislation, which is a little bit surprising considering how much of a pro-business state we are. A lot of people were hoping that it would have passed last session. It did not. The Chamber of Commerce is strongly behind this. The Manufacturers Alliance, a lot of business advocacy groups are, and there is a pretty good sense of optimism that it will pass this session. And if it does pass in whatever form, we will put out that information through the blog. So we'll keep you posted on that. Another bill, Senate 177, prohibits employers from firing someone who refuses to get the vaccine. Chris talked about this issue earlier, and it's, I don't know what to think about this bill really. I think that it's probably already clear that you can't do that. I think this is probably as much a political statement as it is anything else, but it wouldn't shock me if it passes. I haven't done research into who all the sponsors are and what the committee votes are and all of that type of thing. But I don't think businesses want this bill for the most part. I mean, I think that anytime you're creating a new cause of action for employees for wrongful termination, that's problematic. It does build in an exception for those businesses working with vulnerable populations, which is good, and it does explicitly allow businesses to encourage, promote, or incentivize it. But again, are employees going to use that against you and say that's evidence of discrimination? Those are issues that are concerning. We'll continue to track this again and update you through the blog if something like that does end up being passed. So another vaccine bill being considered, and I don't have the Senate or House number for this one, and it was recently introduced, so not sure what the likelihood of passage is, but it would specifically allow businesses to publicize and display the number of their employees who have been fully vaccinated. Chris mentioned doing that earlier. Probably a good idea. I can see why a lot of businesses would want to do that to attract customers, and potentially, incentivize other employees to get it. You can display signs, decals, etc. So, that seems okay. Again, there seems to be this sort of battle going on between we want to do everything we can to encourage, incentivize people to get it. And then that last bill kind of made it seem like, okay, let's give all the people who are, not getting the vaccine, certain rights regarding their employment, which is, a little bit contradictory. Obviously, there's people who can't get it for medical reasons, but for the people that are standing down on political or other reasons, it seems a little bit odd. One provision of this bill that I thought was interesting and would probably be struck if it makes it all the way through the legislative process, but I don't know, is it would require businesses to disclose those numbers if requested by patrons. So again, that it seems a little bit all over the place with respect to, okay, we want people to respect the rights of those that are not getting it. We don't want you to fire anybody for not getting it. But we want everyone to know that, wherever every employee stands, and we would require businesses to find that out. Again, I think that would be struck in final legislation, but that's one to keep your eyes on as well. So that's all. I think we're almost right on time. Chris, do we have anything in the chat that has been left unanswered?
I was actually just answering the last one, so I'll go ahead and answer it live. They asked if in verifying the employee was vaccinated, if they could look at the card, the vaccine card. And I say yes. I say there's no harm in saying verify that you're vaccinated and show me the card. There's nothing that would prohibit that legally that I can think of. I will say that I wonder if some folks will interpret that to be a vaccine passport issue. So there's that whole thing again. But I see no issue with that. The only thing that is interesting is if you're asking them to verify it, evaluate why you need to know it. I can't think of any legal reason why it's not okay to look at the vaccine card. It's more if you're not making any changes on the basis of whether or not they produce a vaccine card. That's the only thing I can think of is what's the purpose of it. And that doesn't mean that it's automatically going to become a legal problem just because you don't have a good reason.
I can definitely see people out there who have objections to getting the vaccine, just telling their employer, yeah, I got it, just so they don't have to wear a mask in the office, or whatever the case may be. If they know there's going to be no follow-up, yeah, I got it, whatever.
Well, I agree with that. If you're going to get some benefit to it, then absolutely you should ask for the card. Or if you're going to do an incentive program, you would absolutely ask for the card. I really like the incentive program. Perry, it may just be more principled than me, but if someone gives me a Starbucks card and I was holding out, I might just do it for the Starbucks card.
Well, you know how much I like coffee, so that I might.
I think you'd capitulate for the Starbucks card too.
Yeah. Yeah, I might be in the same boat there.
I think that's it in the chat. We always enjoy being with y'all. You know, we want you to tell us what you want to hear, or else we'll talk about what we think you want to hear. And we'd much rather talk with you about what you want to hear. So Perry and I were just talking about that before we started. Okay, what are we going to talk about? You know, this last year we've had to talk about COVID, and it looks like we're about to have to go back to what the world was like before, as far as what we talk about. So do give us some information about what you want to hear.
Yeah, that sounds good. We'll probably this summer go back to some, we're going to go back to some non-COVID topics. So I'd be interested to hear what everybody's dealing with. But thanks again, everybody, for joining today, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks for joining this webinar presented by Haynsworth Sinkler Boyd. To learn more about the firm and its services, visit hsblawfirm.com.